My mother-in-law had a special tone of voice she reserved for impending doom, a low, conspiratorial whisper. So when she called about them moving in, I knew her perfectly manicured suburban world was about to unravel. My mother-in-law, Carol, has a special tone of voice she reserves for impending doom. It's a low, conspiratorial whisper, as if she's sharing a state secret that could topple a government. I'd heard it when my husband Mark's cousin announced she was getting a large back tattoo, and again when the neighborhood grocery store started carrying almond milk. So when my phone rang and I heard that specific, hushed frequency, I knew something had rocked her perfectly manicured suburban world to its core. "They're moving in," she whispered, the words crackling with static and panic. "Who's moving in, Carol?" I asked, trying to sound patient as I wiped crayon off the kitchen table. My 5-year-old son, Leo, was in the midst of creating a superhero epic that had migrated from the paper to every available surface. You know, the house next door. The for sale sign is gone. A truck pulled up this morning. I waited for the other shoe to drop. Carol and my father-in-law, Frank, lived in a neighborhood they affectionately called Pleasant Valley. It was a sea of beige houses with identical green lawns, where the height of rebellion was planting petunias instead of begonias. They prided themselves on its predictability. "That's great," I said, feigning enthusiasm. "I hope they're nice." There was a loaded pause. "Well, Jessica," she finally said, drawing out my name like a warning. "They're not quite what we were expecting for this neighborhood." And there it was. The coded language. My in-laws were masters of it. They weren't racist, you see. Oh, heavens, no. They would tell you that with a straight face, probably while clutching their pearls. They just had preferences. They preferred things to be traditional. They were concerned about property values. They worried about different lifestyles clashing with the established community. For the last 10 years of my marriage to their son, I had listened to this delicate dance of prejudice, and every time it made my skin crawl. My husband, Mark, called it a generational thing. "They don't mean any harm, Jess," he'd say, running a hand through his hair. "They just grew up in a different time." It was his standard defense, a shield he used to avoid confronting the ugly truth. His sweet church-going parents were deeply, profoundly prejudiced. The new neighbors were a black family, the Wilsons, a doctor, a lawyer, and their 6-year-old son, James. I learned this not from Carol, who only offered vague, panicked descriptions of a very large truck and loud music, but from looking up the public property records online. I'll admit it was a petty move, but I needed the facts before her narrative could take root. The next few weeks were a masterclass in Carol's passive-aggressive paranoia. Every phone call was an intelligence briefing from the front lines of Pleasant Valley. "They had a barbecue yesterday," she'd report, her voice dripping with insinuation. "At least 15 people. The smoke was just everywhere." Or, "Their boy was riding his bicycle on the sidewalk. Very fast. It's a miracle Mrs. Henderson's poodle wasn't startled." I tried to counter her. "Carol, that's called having friends over. Carol, he's a kid on a bike." But it was like trying to reason with a brick wall. In her mind, the Wilsons weren't just a new family. They were an invading force, a threat to her beige-colored peace. The real test came a month later, at Frank's annual 4th of July barbecue. It was their biggest event of the year. The entire extended family was there, milling around the perfectly landscaped backyard, sipping iced tea and making painfully dull small talk. Frank was at the grill, wearing his Kiss the Cook apron, a relic from 1988, and Carol was flitting between guests, making sure everyone's glass was full and their opinions on the new neighbors were properly validated. Leo, my son, was oblivious to all of it. To him, the world was simple. There were good guys and bad guys, people who shared their toys and people who didn't. He saw everything in bright, primary colors, untainted by the murky gray of adult prejudice. He was in the yard kicking a bright red ball, his laughter the only pure sound in a sea of whispered gossip. I was trying to steer clear of a conversation between my Aunt Marie and Carol about changing demographics when I saw it happen. Leo gave the ball a particularly enthusiastic kick. It soared in a beautiful arc, right over the low white picket fence that separated my in-laws' yard from the Wilsons' property. It landed with a soft thud in their pristine flower bed. "My ball!" Leo cried out, his face a mask of childhood tragedy. Before I could even react, he made a beeline for the fence gate. "I'll go get it," he announced cheerfully. And that's when Carol moved. She shot across the lawn with a speed I didn't know she possessed, her perfectly coiffed hair not even moving. She grabbed Leo's arm, her grip surprisingly tight. Her face was a storm cloud of panic. "No, sweetie," she said, her voice strained, that familiar hushed tone returning. "No, you don't go over there. We don't bother those people." Leo looked at her, confused. "But it's my ball. I can just ask them." "You will do no such thing," Frank boomed, suddenly appearing beside her. He had his grilling tongs in one hand, gesturing toward the Wilsons' house as if it were a biohazard zone. "That ball is gone. We'll get you a new one. You stay on this side of the fence. Understand?" The entire party had fallen silent. Everyone was watching. I saw Mark start to move towards them, a conflicted look on his face. I felt a hot flush of anger and embarrassment creep up my neck. They were doing it. Right here in front of everyone, they were teaching my son to fear a family, simply because they looked different. But before any of us could say another word, a voice came from the other side of the fence. A calm, deep voice. "Is there a problem over here?" We all turned. Standing there, holding Leo's bright red ball in his hand, was Mr. Wilson. He was tall, wearing a simple polo shirt and shorts, and he had a warm, kind smile on his face, a smile that faltered slightly as he took in the scene. My mother-in-law with an iron grip on my son's arm, my father-in-law brandishing barbecue tongs like a weapon, and 20 pairs of eyes staring at him in frozen silence. He had clearly heard everything. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. You could hear the sizzle of burgers on the grill, the buzz of a fly, the frantic thumping of my own heart. Carol's hand was still clamped on Leo's arm, her knuckles white. Frank looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a very polite, very well-dressed freight train. It was Frank who broke first, trying to bluster his way out of it. No problem," he grunted, lowering his tongs. "Boy just lost his ball. No big deal. We were just telling him not to trespass." The word trespass hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Mr. Wilson's kind smile didn't vanish, but it tightened at the edges. He looked past Frank, his eyes meeting mine for a brief, knowing second. I felt a wave of shame so intense it was almost dizzying. This man, our new neighbor, had just been treated like a threat in his own backyard, and my family was the cause. I pulled my arm free from Mark's half-hearted attempt to hold me back, and walked to the fence, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "I am so sorry," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I expected. He gets a little carried away with his kicking. "I'm Jessica, and this is my son, Leo." I gently pried Leo from his grandmother's grasp and pushed him forward slightly. "Leo, what do you say to the nice man who found your ball?" Leo, bless his innocent heart, looked up at Mr. Wilson with wide, curious eyes. "Thank you," he said clearly. Mr. Wilson knelt down, bringing himself to Leo's level. The gesture was so simple, so disarmingly normal, that it seemed to highlight the absurdity of the last few minutes. "You're very welcome, Leo," he said, his voice warm again. He handed the red ball over. "My name is David. My son James has a ball just like this, but his is blue. Maybe you two can play sometime." And then Leo, with the devastating honesty that only a 5-year-old possesses, looked from David to his grandmother and back again. "Grandma said I shouldn't bother you," he stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. Carol let out a sound like a deflating balloon. "Oh, well, I just meant, honey, that Mr. Wilson is busy. We don't want to be a nuisance." Her laugh was high and shrill, fooling absolutely no one. David Wilson slowly stood up, his gaze on Carol. He didn't challenge her, didn't call her out. He just held her eyes for a moment longer than was comfortable, a silent acknowledgement of what he had heard. Then he nodded politely to me. "It was no bother at all. Enjoy your party." And with that he turned and walked back toward his house. The moment he was gone, the party's low murmur returned, but it was strained and self-conscious. The air was thick with unspoken words. Carol immediately busied herself with the potato salad, refusing to look at me. Frank went back to the grill, flipping burgers with unnecessary force. Mark came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "It's fine, Jess. It's all fine." "No, Mark, it's not fine," I whispered back, my voice shaking with fury. He heard them. He heard everything. They were teaching our son to be afraid of him. "They were just overreacting," he mumbled, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. He was doing it again. Making excuses. Choosing the path of least resistance. The rest of the barbecue was a nightmare. I kept Leo close, feeling the weight of my family's judgment. I could feel their eyes on me, on my son, as if we were the ones who had committed the social foul, not them. We left as soon as we possibly could. The car ride home was a silent war. Mark tried to turn on the radio, but I snapped it off. I wanted him to sit in the uncomfortable silence, to feel a fraction of the humiliation I felt. In the weeks that followed, an unspoken truce settled over the family. Carol and Frank never mentioned the incident, and I didn't have the energy to bring it up again. But a line had been drawn. On one side were my in-laws and their beige, fearful world. On the other was me, and I was determined to keep my son from being pulled over to their side. Leo often talked about seeing the boy with the blue ball playing in the yard next to his grandparents. "Can I go play with him, Mommy?" he'd ask, and I'd have to find a way to explain why he couldn't just run over there, not without it causing an international incident with his grandmother. It was exhausting, walking this tightrope of tolerance, trying to shield him from a prejudice he couldn't even comprehend. Then, about a month after the disastrous barbecue, I went to check the mail. Tucked between a bill and a pizza flyer was a small, brightly colored envelope. It was thick, made of good cardstock, with a cartoon superhero flying across the front. It was addressed in neat, elegant handwriting, not to me or Mark, but to Leo. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside, a card exploded with color. "You're invited," it declared in big, bold letters. "Come celebrate James Wilson's 6th birthday party." It gave a date, a time, and the address right next door to my in-laws. At the bottom, a handwritten note from David's wife, Sarah, read, "James talks about the boy with the red ball all the time. We'd be so thrilled if Leo could make it." I stood there on my front step, the invitation clutched in my hand, feeling the world shift on its axis. It wasn't just a birthday invitation. It was a choice, a gauntlet thrown down. I could already hear Carol's hushed, frantic voice on the phone. I could already see Frank's disapproving scowl. This simple piece of paper was a declaration of war, and they had just invited my son to be the guest of honor on the front lines. My first call was to Mark. I read him the invitation over the phone, my voice deliberately neutral, waiting for his reaction. I expected him to hesitate, to start talking about logistics and scheduling conflicts, his usual methods for avoiding a direct confrontation with his parents. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment. "Well," he finally said, and I could hear the resignation in his voice. "I guess Leo is going to a birthday party." Relief washed over me, so potent it made my knees weak. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "You know what this means. Your mother is going to lose her mind." "Let her," he said, and for the first time in a long time, I heard a spine of steel in his voice. "Jess, I saw their faces at the barbecue. I saw what they did, what they said in front of our son. I've been making excuses for them my whole life. I'm done. Leo is going." That one conversation changed everything. We were a team, a united front. When I called Carol to RSVP, a courtesy I felt was necessary, if only to control the narrative, her reaction was exactly what I'd predicted. "A birthday party? Over there?" The hushed, scandalized tone was back in full force. "Jessica, are you sure that's a good idea? You don't know those people. It could be unsafe." "Unsafe, Carol? It's a 6-year-old's birthday party, not a biker rally," I snapped, my patience worn paper-thin. "They have a bounce house and a clown, for goodness sake. David is a cardiologist. Sarah is a corporate lawyer. I think Leo will survive the experience." The mention of their prestigious professions seemed to stun her into a momentary silence. It was a language she understood. "A doctor," she stammered. "Well, I didn't know that." "Yes, and Leo is going. Mark and I will both be there with him." I let that hang in the air. We weren't just dropping him off. We were attending. We were publicly aligning ourselves with the Wilsons. It was a social chess move, and I knew it would drive her mad. The day of the party arrived bright and sunny, a perfect Saturday afternoon. I dressed Leo in his favorite dinosaur t-shirt. As we pulled up to my in-laws' house, we had agreed to leave our car there and walk over together. I could see the curtains twitching in their front window. I knew Carol and Frank were watching. Walking up the Wilsons' driveway felt like crossing into another country. The backyard was a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Balloons were tied everywhere, music was playing, and the lawn was filled with a diverse mix of children and adults, all laughing and talking. The smell of cake and grilled hot dogs filled the air. It was vibrant, joyful, and completely, utterly normal. Sarah Wilson spotted us immediately and came over, her smile genuine and welcoming. "Jessica, Mark, we're so glad you could make it, and you must be Leo," she said, kneeling down to greet my son. Within minutes, James and Leo were inseparable, two little boys in a world of their own, united by a mutual love for bounce houses and red and blue balls. They didn't see color. They didn't see property lines. They just saw a new friend. Mark and I mingled, and I felt a strange sense of ease. David and Sarah introduced us to their friends and family. We talked about work, about schools, about the ridiculously high price of groceries. It was effortless. For the first time, I felt like I was at a family gathering without having to constantly be on guard. About an hour into the party, I glanced over at my in-laws' house, and there they were, standing in their own backyard, Frank by his precious grill, Carol clutching a glass of iced tea, both of them staring over the fence. They weren't even pretending not to watch. They looked like wardens surveying a prison yard, their faces grim masks of disapproval. Their own yard was silent and empty, a sterile beige contrast to the vibrant life happening just a few feet away. Then a small crisis erupted. One of the younger children, a little girl in a pink tutu, took a tumble near the slide. She wasn't badly hurt, just scraped her knee, but she was crying hysterically. Her mother was trying to console her, but the little girl was inconsolable. Suddenly I saw Leo tugging on James's arm, whispering something to him urgently. James nodded, and the two of them ran into the Wilsons' house. I started to follow, curious, but Sarah put a reassuring hand on my arm. "Don't worry," she said with a knowing smile. "I think I know what they're up to." A moment later the boys reappeared. James was carefully carrying a small, colorful box. Leo was right behind him, holding a brand new, still in the package, action figure. A Captain Courageous, his favorite superhero. They walked directly over to the crying little girl. James knelt down and very gently opened his box. It was a first aid kit, decorated with cartoon stickers. He carefully took out an antiseptic wipe and a brightly colored bandage shaped like a star. While James expertly cleaned the scrape, Leo stood beside him, holding out the toy. "This is Captain Courageous," Leo announced solemnly to the tear-streaked girl. "He's very brave. He helps people when they're hurt. You can have him. He'll make you feel better." The little girl's sobs subsided into sniffles. She looked at the shiny bandage on her knee, and then at the superhero toy in her small hand. A watery smile spread across her face. A collective awe went through the crowd of parents watching. My heart swelled with so much pride, I thought it might burst. It was in that moment, as I watched my son perform an act of pure, unprompted kindness, that I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. My father-in-law, Frank, was no longer standing by his grill. He had unlatched the gate of his white picket fence and was taking a slow, hesitant step into the Wilsons' yard. His face was a confused, unreadable jumble of emotions. He took another step, then another, his eyes fixed on the scene with the children, as if he was seeing something he couldn't possibly comprehend. Frank stood there, just inside the gate, a man caught between two worlds. He looked utterly out of place, a relic from a black-and-white movie that had wandered onto a Technicolor set. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and his shoulders were hunched as if expecting a hostile reception. No one had said a word to him. The party just continued its joyful hum around him, but every adult present was acutely aware of his presence. David Wilson, ever the gracious host, was the first to approach him. He didn't look angry or smug. He simply walked over with 2 bottles of cold water in his hand, holding one out to Frank. "It's a hot one today," David said, his voice calm and even. "Figured you might be thirsty watching all this chaos." Frank stared at the offered bottle as if it were a snake. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked from David's face to the scene of the 2 little boys comforting the crying girl. He watched as Sarah came over and knelt down, praising both James and Leo for being such good helpers, her arm resting easily on Leo's shoulder. He saw my son, his grandson, beam with pride, completely at home, completely safe, in this family's care. Finally, with a stiff, awkward motion, Frank took the water bottle. "Thank you," he mumbled, the words sounding rusty from disuse. He took a sip, his eyes still scanning the yard, taking in the scene. He wasn't just looking anymore, he was seeing. He was seeing families, not those people. He was seeing laughing children, not a threat. He was seeing a doctor and a lawyer who had raised a kind, compassionate son, not a menace to his property values. Then Carol appeared at the gate behind him. She looked terrified, as if Frank had just stepped onto a minefield. She clutched the gate, her knuckles white. "Frank? What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice trembling. Frank didn't turn around. He just kept watching Leo, who had now been drawn into a game of tag with James and the little girl in the tutu, her scraped knee completely forgotten. A strange, soft expression came over Frank's face. It was a look I had never seen before, a mixture of confusion, regret, and something that looked almost like wonder. "They have a first aid kit with stars on the bandages, Carol," he said, his voice quiet but clear. It was such an odd, specific thing to say, but I understood what he meant. He was noticing the details, the humanity. The stars on the bandages had somehow broken through a lifetime of prejudice. He was seeing the care, the thoughtfulness, the love. He finally turned to face his wife. "Our grandson just gave away his favorite toy to a little girl he doesn't know, just to make her feel better. And that boy," he nodded towards James, "ran to get a bandage for her without even being asked." He looked at Carol, and his voice dropped lower. "When was the last time you saw something like that in this yard, Carol?" "In our yard?" Carol had no answer. She just stared at him, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Frank turned back and took another step into the yard. He walked over to where Mark and I were standing. He cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes, and looked at his son. "Mark," he started, his voice thick with emotion. Your mother and I, we may have been wrong." It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a dramatic, movie-style declaration. But coming from my stubborn, proud father-in-law, it was an earthquake. Mark just nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement passing between father and son. Just then, Leo saw his grandpa. His face lit up. "Grandpa," he shouted, running over and throwing his arms around Frank's legs. "Did you see? James has star bandages, and I gave the girl my Captain Courageous because she was sad." Frank looked down at his grandson, and for the first time that day, a genuine, unforced smile touched his lips. He reached down and ruffled Leo's hair. "I saw, buddy," he said, his voice raspy. "I saw. You're a good kid, a very good kid." He looked up, and his eyes finally met mine. There was no hostility there anymore, just a deep, profound exhaustion and a flicker of something new. He looked over at David and Sarah, who were watching from a polite distance, and gave them a small, hesitant nod. It was a beginning. We stayed for the rest of the party. Carol eventually ventured a few feet into the yard, though she spent most of the time hovering near the gate like a nervous bird. But Frank, he surprised me. He stayed. He watched the kids play. He had a stilted but civil conversation with David about lawn care. It was a tiny step, but it was in the right direction. That day didn't magically erase a lifetime of ingrained prejudice, but it cracked the foundation. It planted a seed of doubt. It was my 5-year-old son, with his simple, colorblind view of the world, who held up a mirror to his grandparents. He didn't preach or lecture, he just acted. He showed them that kindness isn't defined by fences or skin color. He proved that a hero isn't just a toy in a package. It's what you do when someone is hurting. He showed them that when you strip away the fear and the labels, we're all just people. And sometimes all it takes to bridge a divide is a red ball, a blue ball, and a bandage shaped like a star.